So we are on to our second item of unfinished business, which is the Heritage Designation Heritage Revitalization Agreement for 1245 Harwood Street. As Council will remember, at the public hearing on May 19th, 2011, Council agreed to continue the hearing at the regular Council meeting today, May 31st, in order to hear closing comments of the application and staff, of the applicant and staff, and have discussion and decision on this matter. And I'll ask Madam Clerk to read the summary of correspondence received since May the 19th, please.
Since May 19th, Council has received 28 letters in support and 15 letters opposed to the application, as well as 3 letters related to other issues. These numbers reflect correspondence sent directly to the City Clerk's office between 5 p.m. on May 19th and 12:30 p.m. today.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. And we have Michael Heaney here today from Bing Thomas Architects, who can provide the applicant team's closing comments. Mr. Heaney, welcome.
I should first want to start by thanking all of the participants, all the speakers at the public hearing. There were a lot of issues that were brought up, and what I'd like to do is try and touch on a series on some of the points, and hopefully try and bring some to clarify some of those. The first is the tree, the tulip tree, which is a number of speakers spoke about this splendid tree, and certainly their comments resonated with me. As you know, we spent 4 years trying to find a way to save this tree. And that came to a head last June when it came to Council, and the decision then was that the tree would not be eligible for the necessary incentive density in order to protect it. And that was what was I guess what was disappointing for us was that despite a tremendous amount of public media attention to the plight of the tree, there was really nobody that came from the community to speak up in favor of the tree when it was an issue a year ago. You did hear last week from the neighbor, Sean Wong, who was speaking on behalf of his family, the owners of the property to the east of the site, and he spoke about how they very much appreciate the tree as well, but that they were unable to provide the necessary sort of legal designation of the tree root to protect the tree. I should say that over the years we've had numerous discussions with those neighbours, and in fact it has been very similar to the discussion the presentation that he made to Council. That indeed they do very much like the tree, but when push comes to shove, they're just not prepared at this point to encumber their property legally to provide the necessary protection that the city requires to protect the root ball on that side. So that's something that we have been working at for a long time. We've looked at it from all kinds of different angles, and we just have not been able to reach, or they have not been able to sort of reach an agreement with that. But what we're really talking about with this is the house and the Legg Residence, which has been, through, you've heard from staff, the Heritage Commission, the Heritage Vancouver Group, that this is a Class A heritage resource. In fact, it's one of only about 200 of these resources in the city. It's a very, very important building, and it's been many years since the city has lost a Class A heritage resource. And I think, a lot of people said, well, it's not a particularly significant piece of architecture, but when you're looking at a heritage resource, it's more than just the building. It represents the social history of the city. And it was interesting. I was talking to someone quite recently, and they were saying that what resonated with them about the house was not that this was an old mansion from some executive at the turn of the last century, but rather what resonated with them was during the Depression, when all kinds of people were down and out, the owners of this house subdivided into flats so that members of their family would have somewhere to live. And to them, this was a great representation of the sort of resiliency and values of our community. And so those are the kinds of things which these buildings remind people of. In terms of the city has a wonderful program with this density, these incentive density opportunities, because it allows the city to protect these buildings without, and even though that's expensive, without having to put in any money, because the density provides the compensation to the owner for saving the house. And this is not a value that's come up with by the owner. It's come up with by the city's real estate division, and effectively it's neutral. And what it means is that it's financially neutral for the client to keep the building or not keep the building, and so that's really the situation we're in here. The other point that I want to make is there seems to be a little bit of confusion, and a number of times this was referred to as a rezoning, and it's not a rezoning, it's a heritage revitalization agreement. And it's easy to get it mixed up because it's a similar process. But heritage policy in the city is a citywide policy, because when you have a heritage resource on a property, it makes that property unique. And it doesn't matter what sort of plan it is, whether it's a current plan or an old plan, it's a unique situation, and that's why the heritage policy is used, and that's why we're looking at this with an HRA. Even when there's a new plan for the West End, this will likely be the vehicle that will deal with the heritage resource on the property. It's not necessarily, it's not related to the zoning bylaw particularly. This is also a design that we haven't come to overnight. It's been a 5-year process. We've talked to anybody who wants to talk to us about this project. We've met with all kinds of groups. So we've been twice to the Urban Design Panel, twice to the Heritage Commission. We've met with the Mayor's Advisory on the West End. And it's been a very delicate balance of where you put this density and what shape it takes. And frankly, it would be impossible to satisfy everyone. But we really worked hard to try and find the right balance that respects the house and also respects all of the different neighbours as much as possible. Obviously, that's a particular challenge for the neighbours on the west because their property is built directly on the property line. It's a non-conforming building. But they effectively have a firewall on that wall. There are no windows in it looking towards our project. So that mitigates that to some degree. There was also some discussion about the baseline alternative that was presented, and obviously we relied on staff to some degree in terms of what form that baseline should take. But I do want to point out that really, if you remember the context model that was here and you looked at the baseline model, it really does fit in terms of scale and character to what the West End is. We're not surprised that that's what the staff came up with. Discretionary zoning, like the RM5 zoning that we're in, is not written to reduce density in neighbourhoods. Nor is it written to protect heritage assets. So that's what the heritage policy is for. It's really it's meant to sort of encourage good design, and that's something that we pride ourselves in doing, and certainly it's not just the Director of Planning that decides that, that's the Urban Design Panel, and as you know, we received unanimous support from the Urban Design Panel. Finally, the last point I want to make, and there was a lot of discussion about the previous owner of the property, Dorothy Fuchs, and we were first engaged with her, or approached by her, and I wasn't the one who met with her. That was my partner, Bing Tom. And unfortunately, Bing's not here, but I did ask him to write down a description of that process, and so I'd like to read that today, if I might. And this is from Bing. I was initially approached by Mrs. Fuchs over 6 years ago. She called to say that she had been admiring my work for years and was hoping that I could help her. When we met at her house on Harwood Street, she explained that she was dying and that she was in the process of getting her estate in order. In particular, she said that she wanted to give the proceeds of the sale of her property to charity. She then went on to say that the house and the tree meant a great deal to her and that she hoped that the house and the tree could be retained while still maximizing the proceeds that the charity would receive. She was fully aware of the city's Heritage Incentive Program and asked us to prepare a proposal to negotiate an HRA that would provide incentives to the property holder in exchange for agreeing to save the house and the tree. Mrs. Fuchs was an astute businesswoman who had been involved in the real estate industry for a number of years. While she clearly loved the tree and the house, she expected that her property would be redeveloped so that her beneficiaries would receive the maximum value for the property. Right up front, we suggested that an approach should be made to consolidate the neighbour's property on the east for future development. She advised that her neighbours were not amenable to redeveloping their property, but I encouraged her to try again. Together, we met with the family next door, and unfortunately, there was no serious interest or basis for any joint development agreement or sale. We subsequently submitted a proposal to work on the HRA, but we didn't hear anything back until about a year later, when we received a call from her executor. He explained that she had passed away and that her estate wanted us to proceed with the work outlined in our proposal to negotiate an HRA on the property. We began discussions with the City Planning Department and were advised at that time that the house and the tree would both be eligible for incentives, and they encouraged us to pursue an HRA. We worked on this for several months until a lawyer representing the estate changed. The new lawyer wanted to quickly wrap up the estate, and in order to do this, we jointly solicited bids on the property from 4 different property developers who were all well known to us. The present owner was a successful bidder. I can assure you that they absolutely did not receive the property for $1, as seems to be insinuated by a number of speakers at the public hearing, but rather paid competitive market value for the property based on the baseline development potential of 2.2 FSR. We are confident that under the circumstances, we've come up with a solution that Dorothy Fuchs would have approved of. We have maintained the value of the property while saving the house. Of course, she would have preferred to see the tree survive, but after 4 years of trying, that opportunity was eventually eliminated by the decision in June last year not to allow the necessary incentive density. I urge you to agree to the proposed heritage incentive density that would allow us to retain the house. This is not just to satisfy Dorothy Fuchs' wishes, but also so that all Vancouverites will have a better understanding of the history and origins of the city that we live in today. So in conclusion, I want to say that this is a development property. This is a redevelopment property. The status quo really isn't an option. We worked in good faith for the last 5 years to really find the best way to develop this site while retaining as much of the heritage aspects of the project as we possibly could. And I hope that you'll take that into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. We will now hear from Yardley McNeil, who's our rezoning planner on this item, and providing the staff's closing comments. Ms. McNeil? And we'll have questions, final questions from council to staff and the applicant.
We prepared a short PowerPoint for council's consideration today as well. So if we get City Clerks, thank you very much. And the lights. So good day, Mayor and Council. On the 2 consecutive public hearing nights generated considerable discussion from the neighbourhood, and we've heard a number of questions and comments which we'd like to report back to you today. First, however, as staff, we would like to thank the neighbourhood for their time in attending the public hearings and the comments we've received throughout the process. It is clear that this neighbourhood feels very deeply about this site and showed it in their thoughtful presentations made to Council. They have spent considerable time thinking through what they value about this community, and this has added value to the quality of the discussion on this site. To begin with, we heard a number of questions about what is the city's authority with respect to saving the house and the tree. It is evident the city cannot obligate the owner to retain the house or the tree, but they can apply incentives to offset the owner's costs in order to get the building designated. The application before you does exactly that. It proposes a heritage revitalization exchange for 26,000 square feet of additional density for use on site. Conversely, the city, through the Vancouver Charter, could designate the property without the owner's approval. However, in so doing, they would be obligated to compensate the owner for the loss in market value. We do not have a clear value on that, but we are confident that compensation would far exceed the present value on the site today. We also heard questions about the tree bylaw and whether or not the tree bylaw could restrict the removal of the tulip tree from the site. Section 4.5 of the Vancouver Tree Bylaw permits an owner to apply for a tree permit each year to remove 1 tree from their property. The city does not have the authority to dictate which tree can be removed. A permit is required, and the city can direct an owner to replace the tree if the site is left with an inadequate number of trees as defined by the bylaw. The minimum trunk circumference under the bylaw ranges from 3.5 to 6 centimeters for the replacement trees. In the case of the Harwood Street site, there are 9 trees required on the site given the site size, and the applicant has intended to replant 14 trees as part of this redevelopment. We also heard a number of questions around other properties in the West End, and in particular why some of these heritage sites were seemingly able to be retained without incentives applied to them. We heard a question around 1210 Jarvis Street. This is the Holly Lodge. It's an A category building on the register. It's not designated. It is 6 stories in height. It is considerably over the permitted density for the site, and by virtue of that, it is considered not vulnerable to demolition. In other words, if the existing building and use is the highest and best economic use for the property, if the owner came forward for development incentives in order to help retain it, those incentives would be commensurate with the degree of vulnerability that exists on the site, which is relatively low. Similarly, we heard questions around 1209 Jarvis Street, which is across the street. Another 3-story apartment building in the West End. It's a B on the Vancouver Heritage Register. It is not designated. Again, this is a site that is overdeveloped with respect to the zoning today and therefore not vulnerable to demolition. And as with Holly Lodge, any incentives that the city considers would be commensurate with that degree of protection that already exists today. We have questions around 1101 Nicholas Street. This is an A building known as the Queen Charlotte. It's an B category building. It's a 5-story apartment building constructed in 1927, converted to strata condos later in its life. It was owner-initiated designation in 1997. The owners determined that the present use was the economic incentive to retain the building, as the building is considerably larger than the zoning permits today, and therefore also protected. We have questions around 1119 Broughton Street. This is the Fee House on the corner of Penderell and Broughton. It is an A category building, and the site is designated in 1989 in exchange for bonus density that was used to construct 6 condo buildings in an L-shaped form that goes around the back and the side, and you can just see a portion of that to the left from the slide. We also heard about the O Canada House. This is the house where a version of O Canada was first written on Barclay Street. It is an A designated building. It's a very small site. It also was designated in exchange for incentives. In this case, those incentives came in the form of additional bed and breakfast units that were above and beyond what the bylaw permitted. And lastly, we heard questions around 720 Jarvis Street. This is Abbott House on the corner of Jarvis and Alberni. This is a designated property designated in 1995 in exchange for 33,000 square feet of additional bonus density, which was used in part for the tower behind the site that you see today in the slide. In each of these examples, it shows that while heritage sites are generally unique unto themselves, one of the critical factors is the size of the building relative to the zoning maximums for that site. And if underdeveloped, the site could be considered vulnerable to demolition. In the case of Harwood Street, the building is significantly underdeveloped at 0.5 FSR, which makes the building house vulnerable to demolition. We also have questions around what is the base zoning about in RM5 in the West End. And to that, I'd like to give you to my colleague, Shailen, who will take you through the chart. And then I'll come back for closing comments.
Thank you, Yardley. My name is Shailen Black. I'm the development planner for this project. I'll go over the zoning very briefly. I realize it's a dry exercise, so I'll be quick. The district schedule in this case regulates the amount of density and allows for 2 basic streams of approval. The floor space ratio, the density on the site, is not to exceed 1.0 on an outright basis. That's the left-hand column that's on the chart before you. This means that the consideration of applicable policies and guidelines, the submissions of advisory groups and owners and tenants nearby, the effect of the proposed design on nearby sites and streets and public open spaces are not required. However, the Director of Planning can permit an increase in the density of the site up to 2.2 FSR. That's the second column in the table that you've got up there. This amount of density is conditional, and it requires the Director of Planning to consider the intent of the schedule, policies, and so on. This increased density is designed to provide an incentive to property owners to pursue a conditional application, and therefore, in this case, to respond to the West End guidelines and other policies. Where the difference between the existing and the permitted density on a site is high, as is the case at 1241 Harwood, the property owner would have a significant incentive to redevelop under the conditional stream. To give you an idea of how these options have played out over time in this particular block, and also to understand the surrounding context of the proposal, there are only 2 buildings with a density close to 1.0 FSR on this block, the outright density. They are the 2 properties on either side of the house in question. They are at 1225 and 1285 Harwood. But the majority of applications on this block over the previous 3 to 4 decades have been conditional approvals with commensurate sizes. Recent buildings such as 1330 Jervis and 1290 Burnaby, the 2 en bloc units, were approved in 1990 at 2.2 FSR, the conditional density. The mid-rise at 1219 Harwood was built under previous zoning in 1970 when the zoning permitted up to 2.6 FSR. And lastly, 1250 Burnaby, which was built in 1964 under predecessor zoning, was allowed to build up to 3.0 FSR. If you'd like further description about the built context, there is a brief summary on page 3 of the policy report before you, and there's also a context plan that shows the specific building heights for each address on page 9. Thank you.
This applicant has been working on the proposal, as he's indicated, for 6 years. The proposal before you is to retain the house and a portion of the garden, regrettably, without additional incentives for the owner and the protection of the full root bulb. The tulip tree cannot be retained. Further, given Council's policies with respect to demolishing A-listed heritage buildings, the proposal before you would be considered as satisfying the requirement to explore all options by which the heritage values of the site could be retained. Should the proposal not succeed, the owner would be permitted to demolish the property and redevelop under the RM5 zoning provisions. This ends our presentation today, and we have a number of staff here present for questions.
Thank you very much for that. And I'm going to go to Councillor Louie for questions of staff and the applicant.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is a question to staff. Just highlighting on the slide that you just presented in terms of the outright, the conditional, and the HRA. To be clear, the outright is 60 feet, and it's 1 FSR. Conditional is 2.2 at 190, limited by the view corridor. This specific site has some additional height restrictions on it. Is that correct? The decision making model, though, for HRA is that it does come to Council. For the conditional component, it's a delegated authority to either the Director of Planning or the Development Permit Board under the conditional stream. Is that correct?
Yes, generally, conditional applications not requiring Council's approval would be decided by the DP Board or the Director of Planning, who sits behind me now.
Anywhere between the 60 feet and 190, or the 1 FSR and the 2.2. Anywhere in between there, it's a delegated authority from Council to the Director of Planning or the DP Board. When was that made? When was that rezoning schedule written in that fashion? Do we have any idea?
I have a rough understanding of the history of the densities that were permitted over time in the West End, but not that specific provision.
We do know that the zoning was updated in the mid-1980s, where it was downzoned from the present, I think, 3 FSR down to maximum 2.2 at that point. And with a number of different district schedules, they were regulations were embedded within it to take consideration to a number of issues with respect to shadowing and light and access. I suspect that the DP Board's authority may have stemmed from that time as well.
That's I was doing a bit of research, the best that I could, given our archives aren't so much online anymore at the early stage. So my best guess is mid-90s, and I recall a gentleman coming to us stating that he was on Park Board and had downzoned the West End. But I wanted to talk about the structure at that time when it was downzoned, that it was that decision at the time that allows for this type of discretion to be exercised. Is that correct?
Yes, we do think so. There is a relationship, basically, between the West End zoning and heritage projects, and with respect to tower development. And the city's regulations and design guidelines state that certain things have to be considered, like distance to other property, distance to other towers, rather, site size, shadowing light, and whether the preservation of a historic site is being contemplated. That's embedded into the zoning as it states today. So it's one of the overlying principles under the West End zoning.
Okay. And just to be complete, the only time that it would come to Council is if it's a controversial rezoning or a controversial decision, and Director of Planning and DP Board asks for Council's advice or not.
It would come to you if it went beyond the 2.2 FSR, because this group, Council is the only one who has jurisdiction over that FSR. Anything under 2.2 would end up at the Development Permit Board unless they were seeking Council's advice on any specific issue.
Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Louie. Councillor Chow.
Thank you. Also on the subject of the table you presented with the FSR being 1 and discretionary being 2.2. So what are some of the factors that were made by the Director of Planning in granting an additional 1.2 FSR to bring it up to 2.2 as a conditional? And also in the report, the basic model seems to be based on 2.2 FSR and 110 feet, so that's 11-story. So now if that application were to go forward, does that require rezoning?
No, Councillor. If an application was made for a 2.2 FSR building on this site, it could be considered by the Director of Planning directly. It would not require Council's consideration.
So the consideration to give an additional 1.2 was based on what factors?
If an applicant comes forward and they're seeking that additional 1.2 of density over and above the outright 1.2, they have to consider some of those same factors that I mentioned in my presentation. They have to consider, rather the Director of Planning would have to consider the submission of advisory groups, owners, tenants, the preservation of public open spaces, the effect of the design on those spaces, shadowing, daylight access, all of the typical aspects that make up what is generally considered the package of good design in the Vancouver context.
Okay, so in terms of options for retaining the heritage house, I would assume you tried the various permutation where you put the house. Was there any consideration, say, putting the house right in the front yard, or pushing the house 23 feet the other way, going west rather than east?
Definitely. There were a range of options that were evaluated both by staff and by the architect. If you'd like a more specific description of those options, I can ask the architect to speak to them. But essentially, for every possible position of a tower on that site, which includes the preservation of the house, there are trade-offs to one or another group of stakeholders involved.
So you mentioned there were a couple of properties to the left and the right of the proponent's property that are close to 2 FSR or 1?
The majority of properties around this subject site, except for the 2 immediate neighbors, are at 2.2 or greater. The exception is the 2 immediate neighbors who are near to 1.0 FSR or less than.
Okay, those were the only 2. Okay, thanks.
Councillor Meggs, questions?
Very briefly, I was just curious about Mr. Wong's intervention, because we heard from Mr. Heaney that in 4 years he wasn't prepared to make a statement that we heard him imply, at least the other day, which was that he's now interested in some kind of preservation. What sort of legal complications would that generate for the city? Is the onus on the developer to seek such an agreement with the neighbor under the existing policy? And how would the city guarantee in advance any undertakings that might be in the contributing in the third party's mind? I mean, we've got 2 parties here, the city and the developer. What complications do you see like that? I anticipate some, but perhaps I'm overstating.
I think generally the only way that the city can offer compensation is in the context of an application for development on the site, which hasn't been made. But Yardley can probably speak a little bit more about the implications, or the Director of Planning.
Mr. Mayor, one of the benefits of being on crutches is I'm inclined to let my staff do most of the answering more than usual, but I think I will answer this one for Councillor Meggs. The direct answer to your question, Councillor, is it's the onus of the applicant to do the organizing to protect the heritage feature in its entirety. But having said that, given the importance of the tree, we actually went above and beyond what we would normally do and sort of took a shared approach with the applicant. We actually approached the adjacent property owner ourselves, held several meetings in our fishbowl in our office, explained the process fully to the applicant, wanted them to understand that by agreeing to preserve their portion of the root ball early, they would be very well positioned in the future with a future council to be compensated for that in the way that we usually do. And I even went so far as providing them in writing a letter essentially to that effect. Essentially, Council, I went as far as I could without promising anything, because of course I explained to them, as what you well know, which is that I can't fetter a future council's discretion on an ultimate matter, but said that should they agree to preserve their portion of the root wall, we would treat them fairly, certainly at a staff level, and I had confidence that they would be treated fairly at a council level as well. I went about as far as I could. At that point, it wasn't enough for the adjacent property owner. They thought about it. We had several more discussions, and they just were not prepared to commit at that time. My sense of the situation is that they didn't have a lot of development experience, and were in a situation where it made them more nervous than they liked, and they just weren't willing to commit to anything this early.
Is it fair to say that with or without such an agreement that the owner of the adjacent property would have access to the same kind of opportunities that your staff has indicated to build a tower on that site, potentially up to the 2.2 FSR? So and that can happen in any case.
In some ways, we explained to them that their situation was almost more favorable because they were less constrained by the underground parking situation than their neighbours were. So we provided them, frankly, Council, a fair amount of free consulting advice about the developability of their site in an attempt to facilitate an agreement, but we just weren't able to get there.
Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Briggs. Councillor Anton is next.
Thank you. On the question I think Councillor Chow asked a few minutes ago about the possibility of different arrangements on the site, I think the most compelling group of stakeholders who came were the people in the condominium complex immediately next door who will have this building right up against their courtyard, which is a very, I gather, well-used and popular courtyard with that complex, and would be quite severely changed by this building. And first of all, do you agree with that comment?
Yes, I don't think there's any question that as staff we understand that there is absolutely an implication on the neighbor to the west. We've tried to be as careful as we can with respect to building placement and shadowing, and we've illustrated that within the council report as well. And we can confidently say that the courtyard is free of any shadowing throughout by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So, of course, that's a change to what they experience today, but we try to be, as I said, as careful as we can.
It has a shadow on it until 3 in the afternoon.
At various times throughout the year it could, yes. Yeah.
And the question was asked in a general way, but I'll ask it in a more specific way. Why not consider the exact opposite placements? The house is being moved anyway. Why not move it to the west side and the new building to the east side?
To flip the tower location?
Yes.
We looked at a number of solutions actually early on to determine where was that optimum tower location. And when you look at the tower placed further to the east, what it does is bookend, in fact, Mr. Wong's property at 1225 Harwood, and it significantly impedes any ability in terms of side window placements, things like that, with respect to that site. It's a very narrow site, different than the 1225 Harwood Street, which is a double lot property. There's more flexibility within it. For that reason, in addition to a number of others with respect to view loss for the buildings to the north of the property, we came to the conclusion that while not without some impacts, the proposed location was the one that we thought was on balance the best.
When some of the owners in that property said, we bought knowing that the zoning wouldn't allow this kind of thing, that if there were to be a new tower, it would be in the middle of the property and would have much less impact, how do you as staff respond to that?
I think that's a really difficult question, and I appreciate throughout the many, comments that we've had from the neighborhood that, it's a complicated zoning, it's a complicated design guideline, and as a layperson, I understand why maybe not getting the nuance of that is to be expected. However, the RM5 zoning does permit the variation on what the maximums are. When you've got a heritage site, you're contemplating of retaining it. And so it is embedded into the zoning to some degree on that respect. Discretionary zoning is basically the nature of the area. So all I can say is that as staff, we certainly hope to help the neighborhood in their understanding that cause. And today we presented a graph, a chart rather, in order to get to that a little bit further. But I'm going to leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly when you see the project in isolation, you don't see that impact. But when you hear from people and look at the drawings, it's only 6 feet away from the building, I think. Is that right?
It's the minimum distance, which I think is 6.9 feet.
But the other building's right, non-conforming right on the property line.
That's true.
But the other building was built in the 70s. How much lifespan is in that building still?
I think you'd have to ask the property owners. It is strata, so I'd assume that they're fairly careful with the upkeep of their structure. And, you know, unless impeded by some unknown disaster, I could expect that building to remain there for the foreseeable future. So I think they're all nodding, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Anton. I am going to go to Councillor Reimer, first time questions.
So it's a question on the FSR, and I'm sorry because I know you walked us carefully through it, and I, you know, as a WEMAC member, I've seen much more detailed presentations, and I still am confused. I understand the extra 1.5 FSR.
Would you like the chart to be put back up?
No, unless it's helpful for you. But I do understand the extra 1.5 FSR for the heritage retention, so I understand that piece. What I don't understand is how you go from 1 to 2.2. That's a discretionary approval based on a set of factors, which clearly aren't heritage because the 1.5 relates to the heritage. So what are the factors that 1.2 comes from to get you from 1 to 2.2 to the base case?
Yeah. In order to go from 1.0 to the 2.2 that's permitted under the zoning, an applicant would have to show how they've responded to all the applicable policies and guidelines which have been passed at various times by council. Primary among these is probably the West End guidelines, which offer fairly detailed advice on things like setbacks, separation, shadowing, privacy, the retention of heritage resources, preservation of the streetscape, the formation of an appropriate landscape character to the West End. So any applicant who comes forward and is seeking that additional density past 1.0 would need to show how they responded to that, and in turn the Director of Planning would have to make his or her own evaluation as to how well an applicant has responded to those things in the context of all the applicable policies.
Is it performance-based? Is it quantifiable, or is it simply subjective? I'm trying to understand why the applicant would reasonably believe when they bought this property that it would go to the 2.2, because I don't quite understand that.
There's a couple of reasons why they might have made that assumption, which is correct, by the way, that one is the majority of properties do in fact develop at the conditional density that's permitted. Rarely do we see applications for outright buildings. And that's perhaps a function of land economics. The price of the properties generally reflects their potential at the conditional density, not the outright density. More to the point, the gamut of policies and guidelines that would apply to making an application at 2.2 FSR are ones that are fairly well understood. They will typically produce a building which is generally reflective of other buildings on the West End. So it's not as if those guidelines and policies would produce an especially onerous or odd set of constraints upon a property developer.
So it's a reasonable assumption based on
it is
quite a body of past practice. I mean, I would agree with the comment staff have made that the West End guidelines that the community developed some years ago are as discretionary. They could scarcely be called guidelines so much as complicated set of rules that kicks in. You know, it's a relative sort of argument. Yeah, anyway, you don't have to comment on it, but that's my problem. So the second question was the book ending. So you're talking about, like, why put the tower on this side versus that side. I didn't quite understand. I understood your answer, but given that it would impact one residence on one side, maybe not one person, versus 8 residences and multiples of people in each of those residences, why were staff recommending the side that impacts the most number of people?
Most is a relative term in this context. If you were to flip around the position of the tower, I think you'd probably be hearing quite rapidly from the residents at 1230 Burnaby by dint of moving that tower much closer to them. Conversely, you could expect the folks who are at 1280 Harwood to be happier. I would wonder how many people there are in 1230 Burnaby who would be more affected by flipping the tower than those at 1285 Harwood. But then you get into a numbers game which posits the various citizens of Vancouver against each other as if they were voting on where towers land. We've tried through our evaluation of the proposal to balance off all of these factors. We recognize clearly that there will be impacts to whoever is nearest to this tower wherever it does land. we felt that on the balance of all the objectives, the current position was the optimal one.
Try our best to not make it a numbers game in terms of how many people are affected, as I think Mr. Black alluded to. It's the nature of the impact. So we frequently, for example, see situations where more people may be impacted by an option, but impacted in a more reasonable way, as compared to fewer people being impacted but in an unreasonable way. So there's to your question, Councillor, there's sometimes quantifiable performance and there's sometimes subjective performance, and it's ultimately an urban design judgment call.
Thanks, Councillor Reimer. Councillor Louis, more questions or?
I don't have any further questions, Mr. Mayor. I've prepared to move a motion if there's nothing further.
Okay. The floor is yours.
Mr. Mayor, I've distributed to the clerk the language of the motion, and let me say these words. Let me introduce the motion and speak to it. That staff be directed to consider further options for the heritage designation and heritage revitalization agreements at 1245 Harwood Street, which might include the retention of the large tree shared with the neighbor, given the express willingness of the adjacent owner to cooperate in its retention. Mr. Mayor, this is obviously a very long process, and I have to say that I am very concerned that we're perhaps never coming to a conclusion on this issue because it's been so long. I would have liked to see the tree preserved at the last decision point that we've made, where we were unable to secure the further 40% of the root ball. I would prefer to save that house as well, and try to be respectful to all the policies and all of the neighbors that currently exist there around that site, and not just for now, but into future generations as well. This is obviously complicated. You know, Councillor Reimer just went through in a question and answer with staff trying to understand the nuanced relationship between all the policies and the actual recommendation that comes from staff for us to consider. And this is not an easy task of staff, and so I want to thank staff for their efforts here, but I really do want to thank the applicants for their patience and fortitude in working through with this. I also want to thank the neighbors for their patience and fortitude in this, because in my mind, in the mid-1980s, a decision was made that allowed for a structure to be built in this location, in the RM zoned area, with a lot of flexibility and some less than clear direction. And so it is quite subjective what it is that could actually be built there. And that decision back in the day seemed to be, I guess, the right one, but perhaps didn't foretell the day where we would be so dense and we would be looking for opportunities to save these heritage features, whether they be landscape or structures, and look for the opportunity to densify and provide rental housing and preserve the local neighborhood and feel as well. I personally am not ready quite to give up yet on that tree, and neither am I ready to give up on that house. I think that given what we've heard, and which is new information from the neighbor who has expressed a willingness to discuss, and this was said directly to us, and I would hold that property owner to his word. I hope that we can have some level of fruitful discussion so that we can look for opportunities to save that house, perhaps save the tree and the house, but under no illusions that it comes, either one or both comes without some extra density, some extra height on that site. The rezoning possibility or above 2.2 clearly comes to council. The discretionary zoning that is currently in place, embedded, approved of by council in the 1980s, gives the Director of Planning and Development Permit Board that opportunity to approve up to 2.2 above the outright at 1 and 60 feet. I would hope that those nuanced and complicated differences between outright and conditional and HRA can somehow be made clearer to our citizens, because it is very confusing. But so as we go through this next process, I hope that staff and the applicants, if they're willing, perhaps they're not, perhaps they just want to build to that street outright 1 and 60 feet, continue to do the work that's necessary in order to educate the local neighborhood on what the possible is. So at this point in time, the motion is not to approve of the HRA agreement, but I certainly would be willing to consider this further, but I don't want to give up on that. The possibility is expressed by the willingness of the adjacent landowner to have that discussion, and the possibility of saving both these features into the future. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thanks, Councillor Louis, and good timing. Councillor Meggs to the motion.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Well, this has been a long process, and if I read the staff report closely, it arguably began as far back as 1991, when the owner then of 1225 Harwood had a development permit and didn't exercise it. And perhaps if that owner had, we'd be having a different discussion today. But there were many, many hearings, including a big discussion here in 2010, which Councillor Louis has referred to, where Council decided that, especially in the absence of support from another owner, it was very difficult for the city to commit and provide enormous value to someone around the heritage protection of a living organism like this tree. And now comes Mr. Wong, and I don't criticize him for the position he's taken. It's a completely straightforward one, but he's very late to the game. And my concern with his proposition is that we would put a very, very powerful tool in his hands to continue negotiations both with the proponent and with the city, implying that a decision by this council revolved around his decision to provide protection for the tree in return for considerations that would really actually have to come from the city, because the developer is in no position to give them. And at the end of it, the neighborhood would get 2 towers, perhaps, with the heritage house and the tree. But I didn't hear anybody come before council and say, I could live with the tower if you protected the tree. I didn't hear anybody say I could live with 2 towers if you protected the tree and the house. And so I'm skeptical about that course of action. And this is not to criticize Mr. Wong. He's simply acting in his business interests as he sees them. And our job is to act in the interests of the taxpayers as we see them. During the course of this whole discussion, it became clear that this building is a Heritage A building. And, that completely transforms the discussion. We have a building here which has all of the merits and aspects that were referred to, and the Heritage Commission has said unanimously that it should receive protection. And that's the driving consideration in this entire process. We would have liked to have the tree with the house, but we couldn't get to that point in 2010 because we had to establish a policy that applied in a wide range of cases, not just in this one tulip tree case. And I, for one, at that time voted not to provide the consideration that was offered by staff, or not to approve that consideration, because I just saw a slippery slope. Maybe I was too pessimistic. Anyway, we've been through all of the issues quite carefully, and I think that as a result of the council's decision in 2010, there was some mitigation offered. The height of the building didn't go down, but it became slimmer, which improved the views. Remember, and staff's been very clear on this, it's uncontradicted, that the regular width of a building in the neighborhood under the 2.2 zoning is 80 feet, not 45. The neighbors should be careful what they ask for, because they may get it. And that was one of the real concerns I had here. I wrote down that the staff report says no significant public view from a street or a park is impacted. There's not no impact, but no significant impact. And I've been in places where my view was taken. It seemed like a very serious issue, and it is a serious issue. We moved to this city because of the mountain views and the water views and so on, so I don't minimize that at all. There will be an impact on the neighbors, and I agree that it's greater because we're protecting a heritage house. But in my view, less impact than we might find under the regular zoning without the heritage house and without the tree. People have talked about the separation from the other towers, and Councillor Childs raised the question, it could be mitigated by moving moving the building to a different location on the lot and so on. But I've read closely what staff has said about this. I've looked at the decisions of the Urban Design Panel and of the Heritage Commission, and I'm persuaded that the professionals have come up with the best answer on this site. So the opposition to this to this in the community has been real. And if you read the staff report closely, you can see it's been consistent and strong and vociferous all the way through, and I think it's been a challenge for staff to manage that. But we decided in council a year ago that on a policy that effectively ended the life of the tulip tree if there was to be development on that site. But I don't think that we eliminated the possibility by any means of a fairly tall building. And so we placed with the concerns of the next door neighbors, which are very real, against the heritage building. We might be able to mitigate some of their concerns by having a shorter tower towards the center and so on. But heritage assets are not up to a neighborhood to decide to keep or destroy. They're the property of the entire city. And so the obligation on council is to provide that protection even where it may feel uncomfortable to a particular neighborhood. And we certainly heard in other rezonings in the West End about heritage in a very big way. Not so much in this one, where a number of people were quite prepared to blow the place to smithereens. Now, we got a petition, with 11,000 names on it, which was actually not associated with rezoning, was triggered by concerns in the community about neighborhood planning generally. I'm just about out of time, so I'll very quickly conclude. I have not heard for the community call at large for a moratorium. Some have said that it's a moratorium. It's not in that petition. And the number of rezonings that this council has dealt with in the West End over the last 2 or 3 years is about one major one a year. I don't think there's a tsunami of development there. I know there's huge concern there, and I think council will respond to that concern, but I don't think it's appropriate in the meantime to turn back projects like this, which I think have great merit and have been in the pipeline for a long time. So I do not support Councillor Lou's motion.
Thanks, Councillor Meggs. Councillor Jang.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I will be supporting Councillor Lou's motion to send this one back. There's been a lot of discussion about heritage, a lot of discussion about all sorts of things, and for me, really, it came down to walking that area and looking at the model that was here. And quite frankly, the building was very close to the existing buildings, and that does have a major impact. I know that by law, you can have this much space or that much space, but however, that's a bylaw. But when you go out and look at it, it was really close, and that gave me a little bit of concern. The nice thing about public hearings is you get to hear a lot of different views, that are summarized not only in our staff reports, but also hear from folks who are directly impacted and folks who are not so directly impacted but have a real love of the city. And I heard a lot of different things. Everything talking about the tree is very important, which we didn't hear before in the same way. The house is very important. The gardens are trying to be saved. And so at the end of the day, when I walked down to that area again over the weekend, I just saw a lot of stuff, everybody working really hard to save everything. But everything was in one little tiny footprint. And it was really tough to save everything. And so I think, listening to Councillor Chow and others asking, can we move it around a little bit? I mean, something's got to go. I don't know what that is yet, and I think I share with Councillor Louis. I'm not willing to give up on the tree automatically. I'm not willing to give up on the house or anything like that yet. But certainly, I think we need to have another look. The community has asked very much to have another look at it, and I think they're right, because really it's a lot of stuff in one little plot of land, and this is really a symptom of what happens when you have a lot of policies all coming together on one little spot to a head. And it's nobody's fault. It's just that everybody's trying to save everything, and it all came together all at once. And it ended up creating a development on a spot that didn't quite feel right. I mean, I'll give a lot of credit to the developer and the owner and the architect for it. When you look at the building they designed, on its own, it's a beautiful building. I think it's an absolutely gorgeous building with a passive design features and all that kind of stuff there. But what concerns me is not the building per se, but the fact that when you look at the model, and I build models as a hobby, and I look at scales, and I see a lot of stuff really pushed together. It makes me kind of wonder, and if that's the right thing. But again, it's this whole issue. If you've got a tree, we're trying to save the tree, the gardens, the house, as well as getting a beautiful building in there. What do you do? So I think it needs a little bit of looking at again, and maybe the proposal that has come for us today is the right one at the end of the day, but I think we need to do a little more due diligence. I mean, this may be the right solution. I don't know. But I think there's been enough variables raised in the public hearing that I will support Councillor Lou's motion to send it back for another look, a fresh rethink. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Councillor Jang. Councillor Stevenson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I also will support Councillor Louis' motion that this go back to the staff. I actually would have preferred a little stronger motion and let it be known that this isn't the right development at this place given the current situation. Many times I've walked around this area tried to think about, as a West Ender, what it would be like to live close by, what it would be like to live once this was developed, and I came to the conclusion I wouldn't like it. It's just too much in too confined a space. But I don't know what you do with this difficult situation. I don't know what the staff's going to do with it. I mean, you either have the tree or you have the house or you have the towers. The height of the towers concern me. I'm not that keen on going up there. I understand why. And I understand that the reason that we're going there is to have this heritage, or it could be as a tree, and so that gives us more height. And I think it's not the kind of trade-off that I would like to see there. But I do understand that obviously this is a private property. People have every right to come forth with whatever development they want to, and come forth to us if it's necessary, as in this case. If it's not, if they're able to find a height and able to deal with some of these other things, they don't have to come before us, and the neighbors obviously are going to have to live with whatever is built there. But in the current state, I'm not happy with this proposal, and I do know that we've got others coming in the West End that we're going to have to wrestle as well. And in those, at least, we're wrestling with rental accommodation, and that's really something that's extremely important, I think, to the West End. One can argue, yes, of course, heritage is extremely important, but right now, with the need for rental that we have, I'm much more open to those arguments. Councillor makes a good point, though, on the heritage, that this is a citywide thing and we're protecting heritage for the entire city. But I think that what we've come up with, the price is too high for the neighborhood. So I will be voting for Councillor Louis' motion, simply to make sure that we get back to the staff to see where we can go from here. Obviously, something is going to arise in this location.
Thanks, Councillor Stevenson. Councillor Chow.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I, too, would support Councillor Louis' motion. I know it's been a number of years that the proponents had, to deal with this issue, and certainly for the neighborhood as well. But I think now that we have some new information from the neighboring property, I think it's worth looking at. But the reason why I do not approve of the way this is presented, because I really think the livability for 1285 Harwood is unbearable, given how close the tower is to those townhouses. And I think, as Councillor Stevenson said, heritage preservation is important, but I don't think it's at any price. And if it's at any price, then I think the city would have to come up with some other means and not be loaded onto a site in terms of density. So I think that's important. And I realize we do have a lot of heritage density bank, and it is a whole city issue. So then I think everybody has to pay for it, rather than just the neighbors who are living there under the shadow and have no sun until you get to 4 p.m. So I would think we would have to look at that, and perhaps even the Heritage Commission would have to look at how we deal with heritage preservation. So thank you, Councillor Louis, and motion.
Thanks, Councillor Chow. Councillor Woodsworth.
Thank you very much. First, I'd like to say that I think the building is stunning, and I think it is the reason why Bing Tom Architects swept the awards at the Architects Institute this past Friday, and I'd like to thank them for consistently providing us with stunning architecture. However, I think this is really the wrong place. I think one of the speakers that spoke the other evening talked about this building placing the Heritage House in its armpit, which is a tragic equation to be made about such a beautiful building. I think a building of this stature really needs its own site. 18 stories does not provide, and that location doesn't provide enough space for this heritage. We're losing the heritage really to the condos inside. We simply retain the external area. We're going to lose the tree. We're not respecting the former owner's request. We're having significant concerns by residents in this area. And the petition is quite clear. It says no rezoning without an area plan. And clearly we still don't have an area plan in place in this neighborhood. There's not supposed to be two 100-foot buildings in one block. I think that what we're seeing is really got so many problems with it that I really do think that we have to step back from this, and I think Councillor Louis' motion is a way for us to step back perhaps and take another look at what's possible on this site, preserving the house, preserving the tree if at all possible, but also recognizing the concerns of the residents in the surrounding areas and the need for a building of this architectural quality to be somewhere where it can be highlighted rather than it itself gets dwarfed by the surrounding buildings. So I will be supporting Councillor Louis' motion.
Thanks, Councillor Wisworth. Councillor Reimer.
Well, Councillor Wisworth's speech probably well summed up my feelings. It is a stunningly beautiful building, and I know when I first saw the models of it, I was quite impressed by it. Very innovative from a green standpoint, and there's many locations in the city that I could imagine it being quite beautiful, but right up next to that, to the neighbors, is not one of them. The site itself, when you look at it, it's not so bad, but in the context of the community, and specifically the 1285 Harwood neighbors, I cannot support it. I believe very strongly that heritage should be protected in the city, but I believe it's a citywide issue, and in this case you have 8 residences who bear the vast majority of the brunt of that protection, and I don't support that. I don't believe that's what the guidelines were intended to support. I appreciate that for everybody involved. It's been a torturous process that's gone on for a long, well, I don't know if it was torturous, but certainly lengthy, and probably not always full of joy and light. I would say from my own involvement in the West End, it is a torturous set of guidelines. It absolutely speaks to the deficiency of the community plan that was done in the late 70s and early 80s, and what a hodgepodge and mishmash it is of guidelines and discretionary and conditional and all these other things. And I think the only positive consequence I've taken from this debate, other than the stunningly beautiful building and thinking about what's possible with tower design, but I'm really hoping the community uses this to inform their upcoming planning in the local area to make the tough decisions around issues as a group of community members at a planning table at the time, and not to just throw in a bunch of discretionary and guidelines and try and leave somebody 30, 35 years later to try and understand what all those trade-offs were intended to mean that were put into those plans. I do not regret our earlier decision regarding the tree. I am not willing to give up 12 stories to save 60% of a tree, no matter how old, no matter how beautiful it is. I'm not even sure I am willing to give up 12 stories to save 100% of the tree, but I guess that's a debate that may or may not be crossed later on. I would say that it has highlighted for me also the insufficiency of our tools available to us on landscape resources. So I know Councillor Deal has a motion on notice regarding asking the Heritage Commission or others to look at what we could do to have better tools available to us, as well as the fact that the last significant work on the Heritage Registry was 25 some odd years ago, and community expectations and understandings have moved on, and that's fair and reasonable, and we need to move the policy along too. So I will be supporting that motion when it comes forward, but I cannot support this rezoning as it stands right now.
Thanks, Councillor Reimer. Councillor Anton.
Thank you. I will not be supporting this motion. We had our chance to protect this tree when the staff came and, I can't remember if it was a recommendation or consideration, but in any event, the question was whether or not the tree should be preserved, the parking lot should be built around the tree, which would have been significant cost to the developer, the owner, and be compensation by way of building design at that time. We had our chance to do that. This council made its decision to turn that down. I personally voted in favor of it because, for the reason that the tree is a beautiful tree, once you've incurred the expense of building your complicated parking lot around it, you've incurred your expense of building your complicated parking lot around it. And the tree itself, I would say, probably has an equal or better chance of lasting longer than the house does. Particularly, as somebody pointed out, if the house is empty and not very hard to get rid of well, anyway, we won't go there. But trees are pretty solid and stable. I think that this is just a way of avoiding making a decision. And I think that that's very unfortunate. I don't see any motivation for the owner to want to continue working with the city at this point. It's very complicated to try and put different solutions together. To try and go around this tree at this point is just going to mean a bigger building of some form or other. Probably more stories on the building, which I'm not sure that will please the neighborhood. And I think we should just be making a decision today. And the decision I would make is that I, too, it's a very tough decision because it's trading off the heritage of the building and the preservation of the property next door. And I think in this case, having heard the property owners next door, having considered the tightness of the lot, I would have gone with the owners next door. But that's not where we're going to be now. It's obviously going to go back to staff. And even though I'll be voting against the motion, I can, well, I don't have to read tea leaves. I can hear what people have had to say. So when it goes back to staff, I guess one of the questions I would like to have asked is there a different configuration on the property which would involve losing the tree, but would make it better for the neighbors at the Harwood address? I just think the loss of that courtyard is a very high price to pay for people. So I'll be voting against the motion for those reasons. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Anton. And I'll just add my brief comments. I think many councillors have spoken very articulately in favor of this motion in particular, which is where I am deciding on. The residents' concerns were very significant with the tortuous dilemma, as I think some have put it, trying to keep the heritage house, the tree, the gardens, and incorporate additional density through what I think we all agree is a very well-designed tower, a beautiful building in a very tight spot. But I agree with my colleagues here in that I don't think we have a satisfactory solution to this predicament. And there may be an opportunity to resolve this and get a better outcome than we've got in front of us. Recognizing that it's been very difficult to get to here, given all of these elements, I'm hopeful that under all of the pressure that this public hearing has brought to the matter, there is an opportunity to do a little better than this, and perhaps to achieve a better outcome that gets more than what we have in front of us. I agree that the geography of the site and the scale of the elements is really difficult to reconcile, and I give credit to the team that's worked on this and tried to put together what's there, but the concerns from the residents at 1285 Harwood I think are particularly notable in terms of the squeeze that they are put under, and the heritage house squeezed on the other side of the lot in quite a different situation than it's been in historically. I think it will fundamentally change the feel of that space. So I'm hopeful that one more attempt to rejig these elements results in a better outcome. I'm hopeful that can come back to council, and we will have an easier decision that achieves outcomes that are more satisfactory to the residents in that neighborhood and to the broader city in terms of heritage. And so I will be supporting Councillor Lou's motion. I will call the question. I think everyone has spoken to it. All those in favor of Councillor Lou's motion? And any opposed? Councillor Anton and Councillor Meggs are opposed, so the motion carries. Thanks all for being here today. And once again, thanks to all of those who came to speak at the public hearing. It was, again, lots of feedback to council, and we really appreciate all of that input from residents of Vancouver to help us make these decisions.